and as of the last few weeks I've been talking about my favourite albums, and obviously I'm just going to go through the rundown. Number 1 was Thriller, number 2 was Here My Dear, number 3 was Love Forever Changes, number 4 was Inner Visions by Stevie Wonder, number 5 was Debut by Bjork, and number 6 was Never Forever by Kate Bush. So for number 7, 8, 9 and 10, but number 7 we're going to start with this album. And unfortunately I cannot find my vinyl version of it, so this is the album and you may recognise it. Sign of the Times by Prince. Now, also recommending a book for you to read about Sign of the Times is this book by Michelangelo Mattis from the 33 1/3 series. So, Sign of the Times was released in 1987. He wrote this masterpiece mainly on his own. Prince, in the first 4 albums he ever did, which was For You, Prince and Controversy and Dirty Mind, actually Dirty Mind was when the New Revolution had come in. But by before then, which is his band, but most of the albums were written by himself. So in 1987, Prince's camp and was in decline. His relationship with Warner Brothers was in very much a sticky situation, and Prince had run the course of the Prince and the Revolution and was sick of the sound, so he wanted to strip it down to basics. So Sign of the Times was originally supposed to be a 4 vinyl album, and as you may have heard in the later years, in the 90s, he created an album called Crystal Ball, which is actually what the basis of that album was. So Sign of the Times, he whittled it down to 2 vinyls in the end, so it's a double album, 2 CDs, and at that time, if in 1987, 2 CDs was quite rare for an album to be released. It was very much more of a concept thing in the 70s, but in the 80s it wasn't really done. So why did Prince decide to come up with this? So Prince, to me, this is peak Prince. Peak Prince of his creativity, what he wanted to talk about politically, songwriting, where he was in his life. He'd had the major success of Purple Rain, and which was the movie and the sound and the album, which was his biggest selling album at 25 million copies sold. Then he did Around the World in a Day, which was seen as a disappointment, and then Parade, which was the next album, which was linked with Under the Cherry Moon, which was Under the Cherry Moon was a flop of a movie based on a 1930s noir idea. So Sign of the Times was the album which was to revolutionise or rejuvenise Prince into the mainstream public. So when we look at Prince's Sign of the Times, we have to look at a couple of ideas. So as a double album, released in 1987, it was the same year released as Bad by Michael Jackson, Joshua Tree by U2, and at the end of 1987, Faith was released by George Michael. So 4 major albums which influenced people. The follow-up to Parade, and again it's the spanning of the revolution, the album's songs were largely recorded during 1986 to 1987 in sessions for releases Dream Factory. And again, which then finally became Crystal Ball, and it's also under the pseudonym Camille. So when you actually listen to Sign of the Times, there is this high-pitched voice, which is actually Prince is using a pseudonym as a man with with high femininity. So this is a lot of these ideas are used in the album. So many of the drum sounds of Sign of the Times came from the Linn LM drum machine. Very rarely drums used. It's only on the live tracks on Adore and It's Gonna Be a Beautiful Night, which was then with the New Power Generation, which was his new band. He also had quite a range of styles. So several singles came from the album. The Conscious Sign of the Times is the name of the album. If I Was Your Girlfriend, which was pretty minimalist but also avant-garde idea. And then he also had a concert film of the same name. The album actually became very successful, and actually when he died in 2016 it became very popular. Though it wasn't as commercially successful as Purple Rain, it was actually Prince's most acclaimed album, voted by critics. So when we look at the example of Prince and why he came up with this stuff, the idea of this album is he'd lost Wendy and Lisa, so a lot of this stuff is to replace the female voice. He came up with this female voice called Camille. He used a few things of digital sampler, which was the Fairlight, and there's also some interesting songs where he uses stock sounds. So we've got Housequake, which is probably one of his best things when you watch the Love Sexy tour. strange relationship. There's two versions of that. The version which we got on the album, but also the demo version actually features an Indian tabla and sitar, which is probably an idea which kind of may have started originally on Around the World in a Day if you listen to that album, because it's got a lot of that influence of psychedelic style. You Got the Look, which features Sheena Easton, who was just signed onto his Paisley Park label. And then again, If I Was Your Girlfriend, with this alter ego of Camille. Most of Prince's recording vocals were done in the control room of his Studio One, which was his own place in Paisley Park. And he would obviously usually use his engineer, Suzanne Rogers, to record and leave. When he did the vocals, he'd let the engineer leave the room. But most of the album was actually produced in Paisley Park. With this idea, also there was a lot of things with Prince used a lot of different technologies. There was also some things like, for example, he had a problem with the sound disc, and so the recording of Ballad of Dorothy Parker had a sound matching the dream side of the song was actually that the actual synthesizer went detuned. That's why it's very hard to play that song, because it has this very unusual chordance and sort of discordant sound. So again, most of these ideas of some of these songs were also things from previous projects which he never finished and then put on this album. So at the time when this album was released, and there's many remasters. There's a remastered version which is a 6-disc version, which has got loads of different demos which are really good. But when we look at Prince's Sign of the Times, there's a couple of other things I always look for in this album and why I think it's his best work. Prince, to me, was always more of a singles artist. He did good songs, but they usually were only like 1 or 2, maybe 3 if you're lucky. Maybe like something like 1999 Purple Rain, they maybe had 4 songs, good out of a 9-track album. Not bad. But with Sign of the Times, because it was a concept album, the concept of it was so strong, but the songs itself generally were very personal nature. And I think that is why a lot of people sleep on the album. But critically, Sign of the Times is more interesting, it's more retrospective of Prince's personality than Purple Rain, which was very much a commercial entity, like Thriller, but the difference is with Purple Rain is a lot of the songs sound quite dated, and I think some of them are also quite obscure to listen to. So, I mean, you know, take away I Would I Die For You and When Doves Cry, Let's Go Crazy, some of the other songs you have to be in the right mood to listen to. With Sign of the Times, it's got this very much a DIY bedroom producer feel, plus also you've got this idea of how Prince is using technology in a different way. So it was quite a futuristic album, and if you actually listen to it now, if you listen to people like Frank Ocean, maybe D'Angelo, other artists such as there's many artists who've used this idea of Sign of the Times and created these really interesting ideas. So Sign of the Times, I think, is more influential than what people realise. 1999 influenced some of the house music scene, but I think what Sign of the Times does, it actually was very influential to bedroom producers. So in the 80s, when people heard that album, they thought, oh, maybe I can do this music more on my own without needing a band. So it had this huge influence on musicians to try albums. I think it also influenced many people at the time, such as Trent D'Arby for his later work. And I feel that with a lot of it is, if you want an album of Prince's musical genius, this is the album to listen to. And the one thing as well is what you've also got to remember is, with all of this stuff, is with Prince, it's always got this idea of what do you want to hear lyrically, and I think the lyrics on this album are probably very poignant, obscure, sometimes a bit on left field, but I think what Prince is very good at is that he can show you how to write very regular pop songs, things which are a little bit more avant-garde, a little bit left field. And for me, this album is very influential to the next albums I'm going to talk about on the list. One of the next albums is on number 9. I'm going to talk about is There's a Riot Going On by Sly and the Family Stone. And I think that album was very influential to this, because There's a Riot Going On is where Sly broke up with his band, and then he was starting to do things on his own. And you get this feeling. Another album which probably was very much influential to this album by Prince would have been Shuggie Otis's Inspirational Information as well. So yes, to me this is Prince's most complete album. Like I said, if you want to get the deluxe edition, which I would recommend you getting, there's a lot of extended versions, and then there's a lot of tracks which never made it to this. but they didn't even make it to Crystal Ball either, or the Dream Factory. So like I said, Strange Relationship original version. There's one of the tracks I like is a track called, and I'm just trying to remember it. Oh, there's Something I Like About Being Your Fool, which is actually a Caribbean like reggae track. It's quite unusual. There's a few tracks again I can explain, but for me, when I look at this album, it is one of the complete albums of Prince, and I think it's his best in his catalogue. And I think for me as a child listening to this album in the 80s, I liked the Bad album, which I'll mention in number 11. But to me, Sign of the Times had something where when you're learning music production or learning songwriting, I think this is something which really pushes the envelope. And like I said, I'll recommend this book as well for you to get, this is by 33 1/3. It goes into the actual process of this and explains about the idea of how he changed and where the ideas